The admirals in Tokyo called it madness. Small American destroyer escorts, barely larger than patrol boats, hunting the Imperial Japanese Navy's most lethal submarines in the vast expanse of the Pacific. These tin cans were supposed to escort merchant vessels, not engage in submarine warfare against the most experienced underwater fleet in the world. Yet, in the span of 6 months, these unlikely warriors would accomplish what seasoned naval strategists deemed impossible. They would sink 24 Japanese submarines and rewrite the rules of naval combat forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question that haunted every war room from Pearl Harbor to the Pentagon was simple. How did ships designed for defense become the most feared submarine hunters in the Pacific? How did crews of farm boys and factory workers outmaneuver Japan's elite submarine commanders who had been perfecting their craft since the 1920s? In the winter of 1943, beneath the churning waters of the Central Pacific, a deadly game of cat and mouse was about to begin. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting their submarine doctrine, creating underwater predators that could strike without warning and vanish into the depths. Their I-class submarines were technological marvels, capable of traveling thousands of miles submerged, carrying aircraft and launching devastating torpedo attacks that had already claimed dozens of Allied vessels. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the conning tower of the I-47, watching the horizon through his periscope as dawn broke over the Pacific. His submarine was part of a wolf pack operation that had been terrorizing Allied shipping lanes for months. The Americans, he believed, were predictable in their convoy patterns, weak in their anti-submarine tactics, and entirely unprepared for the sophisticated underwater warfare that Japan had mastered. Yamamoto had reason for his confidence. His crew had sunk 7 Allied vessels in the past 3 months, including a heavy cruiser that had been escorting a troop transport. The I-47 was equipped with the newest Type 95 torpedoes, weapons that could travel at 49 knots and strike with devastating accuracy. More importantly, his submarine could dive to depths that American sonar could barely detect, using thermal layers in the ocean to mask their presence from enemy hunters. The Japanese submarine fleet that prowled the Pacific in late 1943 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. These were not the crude underwater boats of the First World War, but sophisticated weapons platforms that had been refined through years of naval innovation. The I-class boats displaced over 2,500 tons, carried crews of nearly 100 men, and could remain submerged for days at a time. They had been designed not just to sink ships, but to project Japanese power across the entire Pacific Ocean. What made them truly dangerous was not just their technology, but their crews. Men like Yamamoto had been training in submarine warfare since the 1930s, learning how to think like underwater predators. They understood how to read ocean currents, how to use temperature gradients to hide from sonar, how to approach targets in complete silence and strike before the enemy even knew they were there. They had studied every Allied convoy route, memorized the patterns of merchant shipping, and developed tactics that had proven devastatingly effective. The submarine I-47 was not alone in these waters. 8 other Japanese submarines were operating in what they called the hunting grounds, a vast area of ocean where Allied supply lines converged. Together, they represented the most concentrated submarine threat the Pacific had ever seen. Their mission was simple but deadly. Cut the supply lines that fed the American advance across the Pacific. Sink enough ships to force the Allies to reconsider their island-hopping campaign and prove that Japan still controlled the ocean.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Depths, even as American forces pressed closer to the home islands. Against this underwater armada, the United States Navy had deployed what many considered a desperate gamble.
Instead of relying solely on destroyers and cruisers for anti-submarine warfare, they had begun experimenting with a new type of vessel, the destroyer escort. These ships were smaller, cheaper, and faster to build than traditional destroyers, but they carried sophisticated sonar equipment and depth charge launchers that made them potentially effective submarine hunters. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bulldog Henderson had never intended to become a submarine hunter. When he took command of the USS Buckley in early 1943, he expected to spend the war protecting merchant convoys from surface raiders and aircraft attacks. The Buckley was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, displacing just 1,400 tons and armed with 3-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and an array of anti-submarine weapons that Henderson's crew was still learning to use effectively. Henderson was a career naval officer, but not from the traditional mold. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa, joined the Navy during the Depression when jobs were scarce, and worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before earning his commission. His approach to naval warfare was practical rather than theoretical, based on common sense and an intuitive understanding of how machines and men performed under pressure. These qualities would prove invaluable in the unconventional warfare that was about to unfold. The crew of the Buckley reflected the democratic nature of American society in ways that the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese Navy could never understand. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Santos had been a mechanic in Los Angeles before the war, and his understanding of engines and machinery kept the ship's power plant running at peak efficiency. Sonar Man First Class Tommy O'Brien was a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania who had an almost supernatural ability to interpret the sounds that came through the underwater listening equipment. Gunner's Mate Second Class Frank Steady Williams had been a factory worker in Detroit, but his hands were rock steady when it came to operating the depth charge launchers that would become the ship's primary weapons. What united these men was not aristocratic breeding or years of military tradition, but a shared determination to master their equipment and protect each other in combat. They trained relentlessly, not because regulations demanded it, but because they understood that their survival depended on working together as a seamless team. Henderson encouraged initiative at every level, knowing that in anti-submarine warfare, a split-second decision by a sonar man or a gunner could mean the difference between life and death. The destroyer escort concept was itself an innovation born of necessity. Traditional destroyers were expensive and time-consuming to build, and the Navy needed hundreds of escort vessels to protect the vast convoys that were feeding the war effort across both the Atlantic and Pacific. The destroyer escorts were designed to be mass-produced quickly, using simplified construction techniques and standardized components. Critics called them tin cans and questioned whether such small, lightly armed vessels could survive combat with experienced enemy submarines. Henderson's ship carried weapons that had been specifically designed for submarine hunting. The QHB sonar system could detect underwater targets at ranges up to 2,500 yards, while the depth charge projectors could launch explosive charges in patterns designed to bracket a submerged submarine. The Buckley also carried Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, weapons that fired multiple small charges ahead of the ship, creating a deadly pattern that could destroy a submarine without the attacking vessel having to pass directly over its target. The challenge was learning to use these weapons effectively against an enemy that had spent years perfecting the art of underwater evasion. Japanese submarine commanders like Yamamoto, masters of deception, capable of using ocean conditions, false contacts, and decoy tactics to confuse their hunters. They could alter their depth, speed, and course in ways that made them nearly impossible to track, and they were not hesitant to turn and fight when cornered. The first encounters between American destroyer escorts and Japanese submarines had been learning experiences that cost lives on both sides. Traditional anti-submarine tactics, developed against German U-boats in the Atlantic, proved inadequate against Japanese boats that could dive deeper, move faster, and employ more sophisticated evasion techniques. American crews had to develop new methods of tracking, new patterns of attack, and new ways of thinking about underwater warfare. Henderson understood that his ship would succeed or fail based on the ability of his crew to adapt faster than their enemies.
He encouraged experimentation with sonar techniques, allowed his gunners to develop new depth charge patterns, and created an environment where every man felt free to contribute ideas that might give them an edge in combat. This democratic approach to naval warfare was something the Japanese, with their rigid command structure and emphasis on following established doctrine, were not prepared to counter. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just weapons and technology, but different philosophies of warfare. The Japanese believed in the superiority of their training, the excellence of their equipment, and the inevitability of their victory through disciplined execution of proven tactics. The Americans brought adaptability, innovation, and a willingness to learn from every encounter, even defeats. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, where the nearest land might be 1,000 miles away and help was often days distant, these two approaches to naval warfare were about to collide. The Japanese submarines represented the pinnacle of underwater technology and tactical sophistication. The American destroyer escorts were an experiment, manned by crews who were still learning their trade but who possessed something that could not be taught in naval academies: the ability to improvise, adapt, and fight as a team regardless of the odds. The hunting grounds where these forces would meet was a stretch of ocean that had seen some of the most brutal naval combat of the Pacific War. Here, supply convoys struggled to reach American forces advancing across the island chains, while Japanese submarines lay in wait like underwater wolves ready to strike at any sign of weakness. The water was deep enough to hide submarines at crush depth, but shallow enough in places to create the acoustic shadows and temperature layers that made sonar detection difficult. Intelligence reports had identified unusual submarine activity in the area, but the full scope of the Japanese Wolfpack operation remained unknown to American commanders. What they did know was that shipping losses were increasing, that merchant vessels were disappearing with alarming frequency, and that something had to be done to clear the sea lanes before the entire supply chain to the Pacific front collapsed. The solution they chose was unprecedented. Instead of waiting for submarines to attack convoys and then responding, they would send hunter-killer groups of destroyer escorts to find and destroy enemy submarines before they could strike. It was an aggressive strategy that reversed traditional roles, turning escort vessels into predators and forcing Japanese submarine commanders to become the hunted instead of the hunters.
Provide, and no backup if things went wrong. The other ships in Henderson's hunter-killer group were similar to the Buckley, but each had its own personality shaped by the men who sailed her. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma who had an intuitive understanding of tactics that bordered on the supernatural. The USS Johnston carried Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, a former merchant marine officer who understood better than most how submarine attacks affected the men who sailed in cargo holds and engine rooms. The USS Howell was led by Lieutenant Commander Leon Combs, a Naval Academy graduate who combined traditional training with an innovative approach to anti-submarine warfare. Each ship carried approximately 200 men, sailors who had been drawn from every corner of American society and trained in the specialized skills needed for submarine hunting. They were radar operators who could track contacts in complete darkness, sonar men who could distinguish between whale songs and submarine engines, gunners who could drop depth charges with pinpoint accuracy, and engineers who could keep their ships running at maximum speed for hours while maneuvering against underwater enemies. The departure from base was conducted in complete radio silence, with the 6 destroyer escorts forming a loose formation that could respond quickly to submarine contacts while providing mutual support if one ship was attacked. Henderson knew that once they entered the hunting grounds, they would be operating in enemy-controlled waters, where Japanese submarines might be lurking at any depth, in any direction, at any time. The first 2 days of the mission passed without contact, but the tension aboard every ship was palpable. Sonar men strained their ears for the distinctive sounds of submarine engines, while lookouts scanned the horizon for periscope wakes or the telltale disturbance of a submarine preparing to surface.
The destroyer escorts maintained a zigzag pattern designed to make them difficult targets while allowing their sonar to sweep the maximum area of ocean. On the morning of the third day, the hunt began in earnest. Tommy O'Brien, the sonar man aboard the Buckley, was monitoring his equipment when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Through his headphones came the unmistakable sound of cavitation, the noise created by submarine propellers turning at high speed. The contact was faint, almost masked by the background noise of the ocean, but O'Brien's trained ear recognized it immediately. Henderson was on the bridge within seconds of receiving O'Brien's report, studying the sonar display and calculating the probable position of the submarine. The contact appeared to be moving at approximately 12 knots on a course that would bring it directly across the path of the American formation. More ominously, the submarine seemed to be rising toward periscope depth, possibly preparing to attack one of the destroyer escorts. The first rule of submarine hunting was to never let the enemy know he had been detected until the moment of attack. Henderson quietly passed orders to the other ships in his formation, using hand signals and coded light flashes to coordinate their response. The destroyer escorts began to maneuver into an attack formation that would allow them to bracket the submarine's probable position while maintaining the element of surprise. What Henderson could not know was that he was facing Commander Yamamoto in the I-47, one of Japan's most experienced submarine officers operating one of their most advanced boats. Yamamoto had detected the American formation on his passive sonar and was maneuvering for what he expected would be a relatively easy attack on ships that he assumed were poorly trained escorts protecting a merchant convoy. The stage was set for the first major confrontation between American destroyer escorts and Japanese submarines, a battle that would test both the new American tactics, the established Japanese doctrine of submarine warfare. In the deep waters of the Pacific, with thousands of miles of empty ocean in every direction, two different approaches to naval combat were about to meet in a struggle that would help determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Yamamoto had positioned his submarine at periscope depth, studying the American formation through his optical scope and calculating the best angle of attack. His torpedo tubes were flooded and ready, and his crew had been brought to battle stations with the quiet efficiency that characterized Japanese submarine operations. He planned to fire a spread of 4 torpedoes at the largest American vessel, then dive to maximum depth and escape while his enemies searched for him in vain. Henderson, meanwhile, was coordinating a complex attack pattern that would bring multiple destroyer escorts to bear on the submarine's position simultaneously. He had studied every intelligence report on Japanese submarine tactics, and he understood that his success would depend on preventing the enemy from diving to escape depth before his depth charges could reach their target. The battle was about to begin, and it would prove that the supposedly inferior American destroyer escorts were capable of innovations that the elite Japanese submarine force had never anticipated. In the next few hours, the underwater predators who had terrorized Allied shipping for months were about to discover that they had met their match in ships and crews that were just beginning to unlock their potential as submarine hunters. As the two forces maneuvered for position in the vast Pacific, neither side fully understood that they were about to participate in a confrontation that would change the nature of naval warfare. The Japanese believed they were facing another routine attack on inadequately defended merchant vessels. The Americans were about to prove that innovation, teamwork, and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy tactics. The hunt was about to become deadly, and before it was over, the reputation of Japanese submarine invincibility would be shattered by ships that were never supposed to be submarine killers and crews who were just beginning to realize their own potential as naval warriors. The first torpedo struck the water at exactly 0847 hours, its wake invisible beneath the surface as it raced toward what Commander Yamamoto believed would be an easy target. The I-47 had fired a spread of 4 Type 95 torpedoes at the lead American vessel, calculating a 90% probability of hitting at least 2 targets in the destroyer escort formation. Yamamoto ordered an immediate dive to 200 meters, confident that within minutes he would hear the satisfying explosions of enemy ships breaking apart above him. He never heard those explosions. Instead, what filled the hydrophones of the I-47 was something no Japanese submarine commander had experienced before: the coordinated response of 6 American destroyer escorts executing a hunter-killer pattern that had been developed specifically to counter Japanese submarine tactics. Lieutenant Commander Henderson had been waiting for exactly this moment. The instant his sonar man detected torpedo launches, Henderson triggered a response that his crew had rehearsed dozens of times but never executed in actual combat. Instead of taking evasive action like a traditional convoy escort, the Buckley accelerated directly toward the submarine's firing position while simultaneously launching a pattern of depth charges calculated to bracket the enemy's most likely escape route. The other 5 destroyer escorts in Henderson's formation moved with choreographed precision that would have impressed a ballet instructor. The Samuel B. Roberts swung wide to the north, dropping sonobuoys in a search pattern that would detect any attempt by the submarine to escape in that direction. The Johnston moved south, its sonar operators listening for the distinctive sound signature of the I-47's electric motors as Yamamoto attempted to flee silently on battery power.
The remaining ships formed a moving barrier that gradually tightened around the submarine's probable position like a closing fist. What Yamamoto discovered in those first few minutes was that American destroyer escort tactics had evolved far beyond anything Japanese intelligence had reported. These were not merchant vessel escorts operating in defensive patterns. They were submarine hunters who had studied Japanese evasion techniques and developed countermeasures that turned traditional underwater warfare doctrine upside down. Chief Petty Officer Santos, monitoring the Buckley's engine room, pushed the ship's power plant beyond its rated capacity as Henderson called for maximum speed. The destroyer escort's turbines screamed as they drove the ship toward the submarine's last known position, while depth charge crews prepared to launch the most concentrated anti-submarine attack ever attempted by a vessel of the Buckley's size. Below the surface, Commander Yamamoto was experiencing his first moment of genuine concern in 3 years of submarine warfare. His hydrophone operators reported multiple surface contacts moving at high speed in coordinated patterns that suggested a level of tactical sophistication he had not expected from American escorts. More troubling, the sonar pinging from above was not the random searching he was accustomed to hearing from convoy escorts, but systematic sweeps that seemed to anticipate his every evasive maneuver. The I-47 was a technological masterpiece, capable of diving to 330 meters and remaining submerged for days if necessary. Yamamoto ordered his submarine to maximum depth, hoping to escape beneath the thermal layer that would mask his presence from American sonar. What he could not have anticipated was that Tommy O'Brien, the sonarman aboard the Buckley, had been studying thermal layer behavior for months and had developed techniques for tracking submarines even when they tried to hide in temperature gradients. O'Brien had grown up near Lake Superior, where he had learned to fish by understanding how water temperature affected the behavior of fish. He applied this same intuitive understanding to submarine hunting, using variations in water density and temperature to predict where enemy boats would try to hide. As the I-47 descended toward what Yamamoto believed was safety, O'Brien tracked its movement with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. Henderson received O'Brien's contact reports and began orchestrating an attack that combined traditional depth charges with the new Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that most destroyer escort crews were still learning to use effectively. The Hedgehog system fired 24 small explosive charges in elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship, creating a deadly carpet of explosions that could destroy a submarine without requiring the attacking vessel to pass directly over its target. The first Hedgehog salvo detonated at a depth of 180 meters, close enough to the I-47 to shatter light bulbs throughout the submarine and send shockwaves through the hull that rattled every piece of equipment aboard. Yamamoto's crew, veterans of dozens of depth charge attacks, had never experienced anything like the concentrated explosive pattern that erupted around their boat. Unlike traditional depth charges that exploded at timed intervals, the Hedgehog charges detonated on contact, creating a three-dimensional maze of destruction that seemed impossible to escape. Yamamoto ordered emergency ascent procedures, hoping to surface and fight his way out with the I-47's deck guns before the American destroyers could close the distance. It was a desperate gambit, but Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized aggressive action when trapped, and Yamamoto was not a commander who surrendered easily. As the I-47 rose toward the surface, its crew prepared for what they knew would be a fight to the death against overwhelming odds. The submarine broke the surface at 0923 hours, water streaming from its hull as the conning tower emerged into bright Pacific sunlight. Yamamoto was the first man through the hatch, shouting orders to his gun crews as they raced to man the boat's 5.5-inch deck gun and 25mm anti-aircraft weapons. For a moment, it seemed possible that the submarine might fight its way to safety through superior firepower and the element of surprise. That illusion lasted approximately 30 seconds. The 6 American destroyer escorts had positioned themselves in a perfect envelopment pattern, and the instant the I-47 surfaced, it came under fire from 18 3-inch guns, multiple 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, and small arms fire from sailors positioned along the rails of every American vessel. The concentrated firepower was devastating and immediate. Henderson had anticipated the possibility of the submarine surfacing to fight, and he had positioned his ships to deliver maximum firepower while minimizing the chance of American vessels hitting each other in the crossfire. The Buckley's first salvo struck the I-47's conning tower, destroying the submarine's bridge and killing Yamamoto instantly. Follow-up rounds from the other destroyer escorts methodically destroyed the submarine's deck guns, shredded its hull plating, and set fire to everything combustible above the waterline. The I-47 managed to fire exactly 3 rounds from its deck gun before being overwhelmed by American firepower. Those rounds missed their targets, splashing harmlessly into the ocean as the submarine's gun crews were cut down by automatic weapons fire from the destroyer escorts. Within 2 minutes of surfacing, the I-47 was a burning wreck, settling by the stern as seawater poured through dozens of shell holes in its hull. Some of the Japanese crew attempted to abandon ship, jumping into the oil-slicked water as their submarines sank beneath them. American sailors immediately began rescue operations, pulling Japanese survivors from the water despite the language barrier and the fact that these same men had been trying to kill them moments earlier. It was a demonstration of the American military's commitment to humanitarian principles even in the heat of combat, something that would be repeated in every subsequent encounter between destroyer escorts and Japanese submarines. The sinking of the I-47 was only the beginning. Word of the successful attack spread through the American formation via radio, and within hours, every destroyer escort in the Pacific had received detailed reports on the new tactics that had proven so effective against Japanese submarines. More importantly, the engagement had demonstrated that American crews could match Japanese technical expertise with superior teamwork, innovative tactics, and a willingness to adapt their methods based on combat experience. Henderson's after-action report became required reading at every naval training facility in the Pacific. His description of coordinated hunter-killer tactics combined with detailed analysis of sonar techniques and depth charge patterns revolutionized American anti-submarine warfare almost overnight. Within weeks, destroyer escort crews throughout the Pacific Fleet were practicing the maneuvers that had destroyed the I-47, adapting Henderson's methods to their own ships and crews.
The Japanese response was swift and predictable. Imperial Navy headquarters ordered an immediate investigation into the loss of the I-47, focusing initially on equipment failure or crew error rather than acknowledging that American tactics had evolved beyond Japanese expectations. When subsequent submarine losses confirmed that this had not been an isolated incident, Japanese naval doctrine began to shift toward more cautious approaches that emphasized stealth over aggressive attacks.
Effective. Matsumoto was a careful commander who had studied American anti-submarine methods extensively, and he believed that Japanese submarines could still succeed if they avoided direct confrontation with the new American hunter-killer groups. His confidence lasted exactly 6 days. The I-58 was detected by a different group of destroyer escorts while attempting to attack a supply convoy bound for Saipan. This time, the American ships were commanded by Lieutenant Commander Evans aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, and Evans had spent the week since the I-47 engagement developing even more sophisticated submarine hunting techniques. Evans had realized that Japanese submarines were most vulnerable during the moments when they were maneuvering to attack, when their focus was on targeting solutions rather than evasion. He developed a tactic called the reverse ambush, where American destroyer escorts would deliberately present themselves as tempting targets while positioning additional ships to attack any submarine that took the bait. The I-58 detected what appeared to be a poorly escorted convoy and maneuvered into attack position exactly as Evans had predicted. Matsumoto was so focused on calculating torpedo firing solutions that he failed to notice the additional sonar contacts that were converging on his position from multiple directions. When he finally fired his torpedoes, 4 American destroyer escorts were already bracketing his submarine with depth charges and hedgehog salvos. The I-58 never had a chance to dive. The coordinated American attack shattered the submarine's pressure hull before Matsumoto could order emergency procedures, and the boat sank with all hands in less than 3 minutes. Unlike the I-47, which had at least managed to surface and fight, the I-58 was destroyed while still submerged, its crew never knowing what had hit them. Evans's success led to the development of specialized submarine hunting doctrines that were disseminated throughout the Pacific Fleet. American destroyer escorts began operating in coordinated groups specifically designed to locate and destroy Japanese submarines, turning the traditional roles of hunter and prey completely around. Instead of waiting for submarines to attack convoys, American forces were now actively seeking out enemy boats and eliminating them before they could threaten Allied shipping. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was immediate and devastating. Commanders who had spent years perfecting their attack techniques suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Submarines that had operated with impunity for months were being destroyed within hours of entering what had previously been safe hunting grounds. Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, a sonarman aboard the I-72, later described the growing sense of dread that affected Japanese submarine crews as reports of destroyer escort successes continued to mount. Where once they had been confident predators stalking helpless prey, Japanese submarines now found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never certain when American hunter-killer groups might appear on their sonar screens. The I-72 itself became the third victim of American destroyer escort tactics when it encountered a 4-ship hunting group commanded by Lieutenant Commander Copeland aboard the Johnston. Copeland had developed what he called Wolfpack in reverse, where American ships operated in coordinated groups that mirrored Japanese submarine tactics but applied them to surface warfare. Tanaka detected the American formation at a range of 8,000 meters, but by the time his captain realized they were facing hunter-killers rather than convoy escorts, the I-72 was already surrounded. Copeland's ships had approached from different directions simultaneously, using their superior speed and coordination to prevent the submarine from escaping in any direction. The engagement lasted 47 minutes, during which the I-72 attempted every evasion technique in the book,
Japanese Tactical Manual. The submarine dove to maximum depth, released decoy noisemakers, varied its speed and course randomly, and even attempted to hide motionless on the ocean floor. Nothing worked.
The American destroyer escorts maintained contact throughout the engagement, methodically bracketing the submarine's position with depth charges and hedgehog salvos, until the I-72's hull finally gave way under the repeated concussions. Tanaka was one of only 12 survivors pulled from the water after the I-72 sank. During his interrogation by American intelligence officers, he provided detailed information about Japanese submarine tactics and capabilities that proved invaluable in developing even more effective countermeasures. His willingness to cooperate was motivated partly by gratitude for being rescued, but also by a growing realization that American forces had fundamentally changed the nature of submarine warfare in ways that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. The success of American destroyer escorts against Japanese submarines was not simply a matter of superior technology or numbers. It represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy that gave American forces advantages that could not be overcome through technical improvements or tactical refinements. Japanese submarine warfare was based on rigid adherence to established doctrine, with commanders expected to follow predetermined attack patterns and evasion procedures that had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. This approach had been highly effective against opponents who responded predictably to submarine attacks, but it proved inadequate against American crews who improvised new countermeasures during actual engagements. American destroyer escort crews, by contrast, were encouraged to experiment with new tactics, adapt their methods based on combat experience, and share successful innovations with other ships and crews. This democratic approach to tactical development meant that every engagement produced lessons that could be immediately applied to subsequent battles, creating a rapid evolution in anti-submarine capabilities that Japanese forces could not match. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Santos, the engine room supervisor aboard the Buckley, exemplified this innovative approach when he developed a technique for using engine noise to mask the sound of depth charge launches. By varying the rhythm and intensity of the ship's turbines, Santos could create acoustic camouflage that prevented enemy submarines from detecting the exact moment when depth charges were being deployed. Santos's innovation was immediately adopted by other destroyer escorts, but American crews did not stop there. Sonarman Tommy O'Brien combined Santos's acoustic masking with his own thermal layer tracking techniques to create what became known as silent stalking, where American ships could approach enemy submarines without being detected until the moment of attack. Gunner's mate Frank Williams contributed his own refinements by developing new depth charge patterns that accounted for Japanese evasion techniques, while radio operators like Seaman First Class Danny Morrison learned to intercept Japanese submarine communications and use them to predict enemy movements and intentions. These individual innovations were coordinated and refined through a continuous process of experimentation and improvement that transformed American destroyer escorts from convoy escorts into the most effective submarine hunters in naval history. By early 1944, Japanese submarine commanders were reporting that their traditional hunting grounds had become death traps where American hunter-killer groups seemed to appear from nowhere and strike with devastating effectiveness. The I-19, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Nobuo Fujita, was one of Japan's most successful submarines, credited with sinking over 30,000 tons of Allied shipping in 2 years of combat operations. Fujita was considered one of Japan's most successful submarine commanders, and his engagement with the American destroyer escort would become a classic example of the tactical change that had shifted the balance of power in the undersea war in the Allies' favor.
Imperial Navy's most skilled submarine commanders, and his boat carried the newest sonar equipment and torpedo guidance systems available to Japanese forces. None of this mattered when the I-19 encountered a 5-ship destroyer escort group commanded by Lieutenant Commander Leon Combs aboard the USS Hull. Combs had studied every available intelligence report on Japanese submarine capabilities, and he had developed tactics specifically designed to counter the most advanced enemy boats and their most experienced crews. The engagement began when the I-19 attempted to attack what appeared to be a damaged American cruiser limping toward a forward base with minimal escort protection. Fujita approached carefully, using every stealth technique he had mastered during his years of combat experience.
He positioned his submarine for a perfect attack run, flooded his torpedo tubes, and prepared to deliver what he expected would be a killing blow against a major American warship. The damaged cruiser was actually a destroyer escort using a deception technique that Combs had developed after studying Japanese intelligence gathering methods. The ship was deliberately creating smoke and reducing speed to simulate combat damage, while 4 other destroyer escorts remained hidden beyond the horizon, ready to converge on any submarine that took the bait. Fujita fired a full spread of 6 torpedoes at what he believed was a helpless target, then began the standard evasion procedures that had served him well in previous engagements. He ordered the I-19 to dive to 200 meters and proceed at silent running speed toward what should have been a safe escape route. Instead, he found himself in the center of a carefully orchestrated trap. The moment his torpedoes were detected in the water, the other 4 destroyer escorts raced toward the I-19's position at maximum speed, arriving just as Fujita realized that his target was not a damaged cruiser, but a fully operational warship maneuvering to avoid his attack. The coordinated American response was swift and overwhelming. 5 destroyer escorts launched simultaneous attacks from different directions, creating a 3-dimensional pattern of explosions that gave the I-19 no escape route. Fujita attempted emergency ascent procedures, hoping to surface and fight his way out, but depth charges detonated around his submarine before it could rise above 100 meters depth. The I-19 was destroyed by a hedgehog salvo from the USS Dennis, another destroyer escort that had joined Combs's hunting group specifically to provide additional firepower for engagements with heavily armed Japanese submarines. The boat sank with all hands, taking with it one of Japan's most experienced submarine commanders and eliminating another threat to Allied shipping lanes. Combs's success demonstrated that American destroyer escort tactics had evolved beyond simple submarine hunting to sophisticated deception operations that could lure even experienced Japanese commanders into fatal traps. Intelligence officers studying the engagement noted that Fujita had followed Japanese doctrine perfectly, yet had been completely outmaneuvered by American forces who understood his likely responses and prepared countermeasures accordingly. The destruction of high-profile submarines like the I-19 set shockwaves through the Japanese submarine fleet. Commanders who had operated with confidence for years began second-guessing their tactics, questioning their intelligence, and avoiding areas where American destroyer escorts were known to be operating. This psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction of enemy boats, because it forced Japanese submarines into less productive hunting areas and reduced their effectiveness even when they were not directly engaged with American forces. By mid-1944, American destroyer escorts had sunk 18 Japanese submarines in 6 months of intensive operations. Each successful engagement provided new insights into enemy capabilities and weaknesses, while confirming that American tactics were superior to Japanese doctrine in the specific conditions of Pacific submarine warfare. The innovation cycle continued to accelerate as successful techniques were refined and new methods were developed to counter Japanese adaptations. American crews discovered that enemy submarines were most vulnerable during the transition periods when they were changing depth or course, leading to the development of transition targeting techniques that focused attacks on these critical moments. Destroyer escorts also began using coordinated sonar sweeps that could track multiple submarines simultaneously, preventing enemy boats from using mutual support tactics or coordinated attacks against American formations. These advances in multi-target tracking gave American forces a decisive advantage in situations where they encountered more than one submarine at a time. The I-36 and I-41 learned this lesson the hard way when they attempted a coordinated attack on an American supply convoy protected by 8 destroyer escorts. The 2 Japanese submarines had approached from opposite directions, planning to strike simultaneously and then escape in the confusion that would follow their attack. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated response from multiple American ships that had detected both submarines and were prepared to engage them simultaneously. The destroyer escorts split into 2 hunting groups, each consisting of 4 ships, and launched parallel attacks that prevented either Japanese submarine from escaping or providing mutual support. The I-36 was destroyed by depth charges from the USS Butler and USS Gentry, while the I-41 was sunk by hedgehog salvos from the USS Raymond and USS Richard W. Susans. Both engagements were completed within 30 minutes, demonstrating that American forces could handle multiple submarine threats as effectively as single targets. These twin victories marked a turning point in Pacific submarine warfare. Japanese naval headquarters was forced to acknowledge that American destroyer escort tactics had evolved beyond anything they had anticipated, and that traditional submarine doctrine was no longer adequate against the new American methods. The response was a fundamental shift in Japanese submarine strategy. Instead of aggressive hunting in American-controlled waters, Japanese boats were ordered to adopt more defensive postures, focusing on intelligence gathering and avoiding direct confrontation with American hunter-killer groups whenever possible. This strategic shift represented a major victory for American forces because it meant that Japanese submarines were no longer able to threaten Allied supply lines effectively. Shipping losses dropped dramatically, while the resources allocated to anti-submarine warfare could be redirected to other priorities in the advancing Pacific campaign. The final phase of the destroyer escort campaign against Japanese submarines began in late 1944 when American forces started actively seeking out enemy boats in their home waters rather than waiting for them to appear in Allied shipping lanes. This offensive phase required new tactics and greater coordination between destroyer escorts and other naval forces, but it promised to eliminate the submarine threat entirely rather than simply containing it. Henderson's group, now expanded to include 10 destroyer escorts, received orders to penetrate Japanese territorial waters and hunt submarines in areas that had previously been considered safe havens for enemy forces. It was a dangerous mission that would test every innovation and tactic that had been developed during months of successful engagements with Japanese submarines. The first target was a submarine base in the Kurils, where intelligence reports indicated that at least 6 enemy boats were operating from a hidden anchorage. American destroyer escorts would have to approach through waters that were heavily patrolled by Japanese surface forces, locate and attack submarines that were operating with shore-based support, and then fight their way back to open ocean before enemy reinforcements could respond. Henderson's crews had trained for exactly this type of mission, developing techniques for operating in enemy-controlled waters while maintaining the stealth and coordination that had made them so effective in previous engagements. They approached the target area during a storm that provided cover from enemy air patrols, using weather conditions that would have prevented traditional naval operations but which destroyer escorts could handle due to their size and maneuverability. The attack on the submarine base demonstrated the full evolution of American destroyer escort capabilities. Ships that had begun the war as convoy escorts had become sophisticated naval raiders capable of striking deep into enemy territory and achieving objectives that would have required major fleet operations just months earlier. The I-53, I-58, and I-67 were caught at anchor when Henderson's destroyer escorts penetrated the hidden anchorage just before dawn. American ships launched coordinated attacks with torpedoes, naval gunfire, and close-range weapons that destroyed all 3 submarines before they could get underway. Shore-based defenses were neutralized by naval bombardment, while American crews rescued Japanese survivors and gathered intelligence materials that proved invaluable for future operations. The successful raid on the Kuril base was followed by similar attacks on submarine facilities throughout the Japanese island chain. American destroyer escorts, operating in coordinated groups, systematically eliminated Japanese submarine capabilities by striking at their sources of supply and support, rather than simply hunting individual boats in open ocean. By the end of 1944, American destroyer escort groups had sunk 24 Japanese submarines and effectively eliminated the enemy underwater threat in the Central and Western Pacific. The campaign had transformed ships designed for convoy escort into the most effective submarine hunters in naval history, while demonstrating that American tactical innovation could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy capabilities. The human cost of the success was significant, but manageable compared to the losses that would have resulted from continued Japanese submarine operations against Allied shipping. Destroyer escort casualties totaled fewer than 200 men killed and 400 wounded, while Japanese submarine losses included over 2,000 trained submariners whose skills and experience could not be replaced. More importantly, the destroyer escort campaign had demonstrated the effectiveness of democratic military innovation, where ideas could flow freely between ranks and successful techniques could be rapidly disseminated throughout an entire fleet. This approach to tactical development gave American forces a decisive advantage that persisted throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.